Welcome to the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast, presented by the Beef Cattle Research Council. The most popular content from beefresearch.ca, available on the go. Before we get into this week's episode, a quick message from the BCRC.
Cows with an ideal body condition score around 3.0 can rebreed up to 30 days sooner than thin cows. This means more cows calve in the first 21-day cycle, resulting in heavier calves at weaning with gains of up to 42 pounds. Maintaining ideal body condition also leads to higher pregnancy rates, nearly double those of cows in poor condition, along with better milk production, fewer abortions and stillbirths, healthier calves, and fewer calving difficulties. Learn more about body condition scoring and beef cattle through the link in the show notes. This episode features the BCRC's Science Director, Dr. Reynold Bergen.
Hi there, I'm Reynold. This Research on the Record article originally appeared in the November 2025 issue of Canadian Cattleman magazine. It's been reposted on the beefresearch.ca site with the publisher's permission. And today we're talking about growth promoters and the environment revisited. So back in October 2021, this column described a research project that measured how long the residues from growth promoters stay around in the feedlot environment. And those researchers learned that residues from trenbolone acetate, or TBA, which is found in some growth promotants, it mimics testosterone. So residues from TBA dissipate very quickly after the animal excretes them. And they found that the same is true for melangestrol acetate, or MGA, which is a feed additive that's sometimes used in feeder heifers to suppress heat or estrus. But they found that residues from ractopamine, which is a feed additive that helps to improve feed efficiency and weight gain and leanness late in the feeding period, residues from ractopamine could be found on the pen floor for up to 5 months after it was last fed. So at that point, John Chalice and his collaborators at Agriculture Canada and the University of Saskatchewan started a follow-up study, and they've recently published it, looking at whether composting manure or stockpiling manure or incorporating manure into the soil helps to break down those ractopamine residues. And they also looked at whether ractopamine residues can affect hormone levels in other organisms that may come in contact with them in the environment. And so that research has been published, and it's linked in the online version of this article if you want to look that up yourself. So how did they do this? Well, they raised 4 pens of feedlot steers using both implants that contain TBA, as well as fed them ractopamine during the last 40 days of the finishing period. And then another 4 pens of steers were raised without either of those growth promoters. Now, once the 273-day feeding period ended, the pens were cleaned, and the manure that came from those pens were windrowed on 12 separate pads. So there were 6 windrows from the pens that had growth promoters and 6 windrows from pens of cattle that were raised without growth promoters. Now, half of the windrows, so 3 per treatment, were left undisturbed and stockpiled for a month. The other windrows were composted for a month and then turned on days 17 and 14. So that's the difference between stockpiling and composting. When you talk about composting, that's taking a pile of manure and turning it now and then. When we're talking about stockpiling, it's just piling up the manure and leaving it to sit. Each windrow of manure was sampled at 7 different time points throughout the composting or stockpiling process, and then they analyzed the residue levels in the lab. And they also took some raw manure that hadn't yet been composted or stockpiled it and applied it to soil that had never received manure before. And they applied it at a rate equivalent to 24 long tons per acre. They cultivated it in and then sampled it at 9 different time points afterwards. Now, they also, in the lab, they extracted ractopamine and TBA residues from the samples they collected and analyzed them to see whether stockpiling or composting or incorporating into soil would help break down the residues. They also looked at the samples from days 0, 4, and 28 and used those in bioassays to see whether the ractopamine occurred at high enough levels to impact even the most sensitive organisms. So to do this, they used 2 different bioassays. So one of these bioassays used a breast cancer cell line that was extremely sensitive to factors that could either increase or decrease testosterone production. And the second bioassay used a breast cancer cell line that was extremely sensitive to factors that could dramatically increase or decrease estrogen production. So sometimes you'll hear about how environmental pollutants can cause skewed sex ratios in frogs or fish or whatever. And the breast cancer cell lines they used in this study were even more sensitive than those aquatic organisms. So this was very much a canary in the coal mine thing. If they saw anything here, then it was like the worst case scenario. So what did they learn? Well, they found that levels of TBA and its metabolites were too low to even detect, even on day 0. And that's not real surprising because that previous study that we wrote about a couple of years ago found the same thing. Now, when they looked at ractopamine, they compared stockpiling to composting. They found that both approaches to manure handling had similar effects, and levels of ractopamine dropped by at least 95% by the end of the 28-day trial. And most of those reductions happened within the first 10 days of when the piles were first formed. Now, in terms of the raw manure that was spread and incorporated into soil, they found that ractopamine levels were much lower after raw manure got incorporated. That's partly because just doing that diluted the manure by the soil. But ractopamine levels also dropped by 80% over the next 4 weeks. And again, most of that decline happened within the first 10 days after the manure was spread. And when it came to the bioassays, they found that exposing manure extracts to the highly sensitive cancer cell line did not affect androgen production, so that's testosterone. They found that manure extracts did affect the estrogen bioassay, but that was not because of the growth promoters. Manure from the steers that had received ractopamine had the same effect on the estrogen bioassay as manures from the steers that didn't get any growth promoters. So what was happening there? Well, the estrogen effect from the manure was probably stimulated by naturally occurring estrogen that was produced by the animals or by plant estrogens, which is, they're also called phytoestrogens, that came from the feed or some combination of the animal and the feed, because all animals produce estrogen and many plants contain phytoestrogen. So manure from other livestock or pets or humans or birds would very likely have the same estrogenic effect as cattle manure did. So the bottom line is that a month of stockpiling or composting effectively reduced ractopamine levels to harmless levels in feedlot manure. Stockpiling or composting manure longer would virtually eliminate any remaining residues. And these are both common manure management practices. In 2021, the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef surveyed 333 cattle producers across the country and found that 17% of producers compost manure and 66% of them stockpile beef manure before they spread it. So what does this mean to you? Well, it's not always possible, but it's always best to have science-based answers before hard questions arise. Growth promoters are a tremendously valuable tool for the feedlot sector. We've known for decades that beef from cattle that are raised using growth promoters is just as safe and nutritious as beef from cattle that were raised without them. And this research looked for and failed to find potential effects of those growth promoters on environmental health. So common manure management practices like stockpiling and composting not only make manure lighter and easier to haul and spread, but they also help to protect the environment. So thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. You can find all relevant links and information at beefresearch.ca or in the show notes. The Beef Cattle Research Council is funded by the Canadian Beef Cattle Checkoff and strives for excellence in the production of Canadian beef, cattle, and forage through research, innovation, and extension. Tune in every Tuesday as the Canadian Beef Cattle Podcast delivers straightforward insights, expert information, and a wealth of practical knowledge for Canadian beef producers. Subscribe now.